Hey, Jenna.
Hey, Dom.
Jenna, I have
Okay.
to come clean about something.
Oh my God.
There's not a day that goes by that I don't check out the New York Post or
Oh,
Page
because
Six.
you're the only one.
It's such a guilty pleasure of mine.
It's everybody's guilty pleasure. And listen, those headlines, they don't miss.
They do not. Question though, do you have a favorite?
Jenna and Tonic, if you remember, you remember.
Well, my favorite is Kiss Your Asteroid Goodbye. But asteroid with one S? I mean, come on, New York Post.
Well, listen, everybody's got their favorite headline. That's one of the things about the Post that makes them them. And we've actually got an interview with somebody who helped make the New York Post the paper that it is. Let's start the show. Hi, I'm Jenna.
And I'm Dom. You know what's funny? Not long ago, we were both breaking news. Now we're
Breaking unemployment records.
exactly just like thousands of other journalists who've been laid off from newsrooms across the country.
Yeah, and after the shock wore off, we kept asking ourselves, what the hell do we do now?
And over many, many cups of coffee,
And maybe a few drinks.
we realized we had a unique opportunity here. Why not pull back the curtain on what's really happening in American media?
Right? I mean, we've spent years in this industry seeing how stories get made or don't, and now we can actually talk about it.
And trust me, there's a lot to talk about. From local news disappearing to social media reshaping journalism, we'll break it all down.
And look, we're not here to lecture anybody. We just want to help make sense of the information that we're getting and maybe have some much needed fun along the way.
So whether you're glued to the news, just trying to figure out what's real in your feed, or curious about the future of media, come hang with us.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking, a podcast where two journalists
Are taking a critical look at American media.
Okay, so Dom, we're going to do things a little bit different this week.
Hmm.
And instead of talking about the stories behind the headlines, we're just going to talk about the headlines. And this week, we're going to talk about our favorite giver of headlines, the New York Post.
Oh, they give such good headline.
They give
They
such
do.
good headlines.
Such good headline. We love them.
All right, so if you going to the New York Post website and we scroll through and got some headlines, what were some of the ones that jumped out to you that you were just like,
Uh,
"Excuse me, I
okay.
beg all of your pardons"?
Well, this is not one of those just yet. We discussed trying to start off with they do cover real of course, New York Post covers real news,
Of
they cover,
course,
but
yes.
they do make it, they have their little cheekiness to the headlines. This first one we're reading is pumping the brakes. I love a pumping the brake
Of
headline.
course, yes.
Pumping the pumping the brakes. Trump announces 1 month delay of US tariffs for cars from Canada, Mexico. So
And that's a very serious story because
it's yep,
that
yep.
was terrifying for people who are in the market for cars. Like if the price goes up $12,000 or whatever people were predicting, that was like, well, then I guess I'll just drive a clunker forever.
Well, let's see what happens with that.
Exactly.
Let's see
We'll
how
see
long
what
it
happens
lasts.
because it is going to happen. It's so will they, won't they? And but it's not fun. This is not rom-commy at all.
No,
It's like
no.
costing all of us years off our life. Okay, so moving on throughout the paper, also came across no kidding. Octomom regrets not suing fertility doctor after having 14 kids. Now, I can't imagine anybody who's listening to this does not know who Octomom is, except for the fact that you probably forgot, and now you're just like, wait, what?
Yes. And if you don't know, you can click the link
Yeah,
in
we're
our
gonna
description.
provide links to all
Yep.
these stories in, our show notes,
Read it
but
yourself.
yeah, like you regret not because I remember that Dr. Phil interview that she did where she swore up and down that, like, no, love just multiplies no matter how many kids you have. And all of the harried, exhausted mothers in the audience were just like, girl, what? Love multiplies. 24 hours do not.
I love that. Octomom. That was just the story that kept on giving during that. Okay. So our next one is another, just so everybody knows, we stopped looking at the serious stories. We just go right into like the more
Well,
gossipy stories
that's
because
what
their
makes the
headlines are
post a
so great.
post. Yeah.
This one, crock and roll. Kim Kardashian slipped into a skin tight.
Of course, some sort of whatever skexy thing that she was wearing for an Oscars after party, yada yada yada. Um, it's just crock and roll. And I'll
Oh,
be honest, the first time I glanced at that headline, that's not what I read. I glanced at it said cock and roll.
cra- that's what they do. It's sort of that. It's that whole thing of where you think I forget what it's called when you remember things a certain way. You're like, no, wait a minute. It was always Bernstein versus Bernstein. Remember, like it's like how you remember certain things from your childhood. Same thing here. It's like, wait, no, I swore I saw cock and roll. And
Well, I
it's
mean,
really
listen,
crock and
given
roll.
like who the subject was about, and this is not to besmirch Ms.
No,
Kardashian at all, but yeah, the way that
they know what
they
they're doing. They know what they're
exactly.
doing. I didn't read that. Yeah, Kim Kardashian slipped into a skin tight croc embossed leather gown for Oscars 2025 after party. Oh, after party. Oh,
How
I was
many
there.
after parties are there?
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
I think we have your favorite one next, Jenna.
Oh. Hard to watch Meghan Markle's estranged half-brother slams Markley stories about her childhood in new Netflix show. Okay, first of all, that's a big mouthful to begin with.
It is.
But honestly, at this point, with the headlines that I keep reading about this woman, I keep going back to that quote from The Devil Wears Prada, where the character, what was it, Miranda Priestley? Rupert
Oh,
Murdoch should cut me a check for all the papers I sell for him. Because how many headlines have they made off of this woman?
that was Meryl Streep's character, right? That's
Yes,
who
that
she
was
played.
Meryl
Like,
Streep.
okay.
Yes.
Okay. Oh my God. I love it. Yes, they've made a lot off of Meghan Markle.
Like literally
They
every
have.
single little thing she does. Now, I admit I have not watched this Netflix
No, I have
lifestyle,
not.
whatever. It doesn't really seem like it's my vibe. But still though, like, oh my God, the amount of hate that I've seen come for it is just, guys, maybe calm down a little bit. If you don't like it, don't watch it. The end.
All right, the last one we have here is Bye Bye Bieber. Justin Bieber's longtime personal assistant quits amid concerns about pop star's behavior report. So it's not them. It's from, I guess they're citing somebody else reporting it.
Is that
But
kind of like, I guess, the official way of being like, allegedly?
yeah, I think that's what I do. I think they'll just like, or
Allegedly.
it pretty much is. Oh, it's because, yes, it's US. I guess they're reporting it from like the US Sun, like when they just sort of want to get the story. But I love the Bye Bye Bieber because of, well, there's a lot of different, I go to um Bye 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 from NSYNC is where my
Oh
mind
my
goes.
God.
Bye bye
How is,
bye.
I am so like, okay, I might be technically younger, but I am so much older because my mind went to Bye Bye Birdie.
Yes, I know. I think it's I just like, but that's the first thing I'm saying, being honest, that's the first thing I thought of was like bye bye bye. I'm like,
But that's the
and they just did.
genius of that headline, though, is that it doesn't matter who you are or what generation, there's something that you could read into it and assume that you know what I'm saying?
I agree. I agree. It's like it can connect to anybody. Everybody sees something different. Sometimes you see a cock, sometimes you see a croc.
Swear
You
to
know
God,
what I
I swear to
mean?
God, that's what I thought I said.
Yeah, this is how it rolls.
Well, actually, we've got a great conversation, a great interview with somebody who worked behind the scenes and behind the headlines of the infamous New York Post. The New York Post, it's been celebrated by some as iconic and condemned by others as a force for evil. Love it or hate it, you can't ignore it. And for nearly 50 years, it has delivered outrageous headlines, shaped pop culture, and left a permanent mark on American media. So when Rupert Murdoch took control in 1977, he transformed the Post with an attitude best summed up by former Post photographer Adam Scull. We're the New York Post. Fuck you and your rules. We make our own rules.
Frank DiGiacomo knows this world well. He is a former New York Post reporter, Page Six editor, and he's the co-author of Paper of Wreckage, an oral history of the Post, packed with stories about newsroom chaos, larger-than-life characters, and the paper's wild influence on politics, media, and gossip. These days, he's an executive editor at Billboard. Frank, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
All right. So, Frank, let's start off with a little bit of a history lesson because I was shocked to find out. First of all I knew in terms of the history of the Post was the little bitty line from the Hamilton musical. But beyond that, I didn't know that before 1977, the paper had a more liberal slant to it, which was news to me because apparently Rupert Murdoch came in the same time I literally showed up on this earthly plane. So the Post had always been a Murdoch paper to me.
Right. So after Alexander Hamilton founded in 1801, I mean, fast forward to 1939, Dorothy Schiff, the granddaughter of Jacob Schiff, a powerful banker and sort of one of the main heads of the German Jewish aristocracy in New York City, buys it. And the paper's heyday really is in the 1950s when it was run by James Wexler, who's a progressive liberal icon in the journalism world. And they did a lot of amazing investigative reporting on the powers of that time. Robert Moses, the urban planner, Walter Winchell, who was the most powerful gossip columnist in the world, and J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, as well as Senator Joseph McCarthy. And from there, you get into in the 1970s, mid 70s. The Post is losing money. She was very cheap to begin with, but once the Post paper really started losing money, she decided to sell it. And in 1976, Murdoch buys it. He takes control of it in 1977. Um, your Adam Skull quote is a great quote. Initially, we talked to a number of people who were there at the time, and one put it as Sid Vicious taking over the Philharmonic, and Frank Rich called it the Nazis marching into Poland.
Eek. Well, I know the title of your book, actually, Paper of Wreckage, comes from the nickname that the staffers had of the Post because they were like, we're a paper of wreckage, not we're anything but a paper of record. So were they in on the attitude of everybody who worked there was really in on the attitude of the Post?
Yeah, you have to start with, and you probably recognize this. A gallows humor is the favorite kind of humor of people who work in newspapers, especially at tabloids. In terms of pushing the limits of journalism and maybe stepping over the ethics of journalism, it was a choice at the Post. They never forced you to do anything that you wouldn't do. Some people like to play fast and loose with the facts. Other people were not going to make that move. And, we saw a lot of excellent journalists, in fact, Pulitzer winning journalists leave the Post and then get the prize. I mean, Devlin Barrett, Maggie Haberman. So it produced a lot of fantastic journalists. It also produced a lot of prevaricators.
That's definitely a good way to put it. Okay, so how would you then describe what the paper's role was in American media? Because it seems like what started at the Post has rippled out throughout the rest of the country.
Yeah, I think the Post is underestimated in terms of its effect on journalism. It's really the foundation of Murdoch's American empire. He comes into the United States. First, he buys some tabloids in Texas, but it's not until he moves to New York, which is the capital of media, and he establishes the Post, which is shocking, but it gets people's attention. And the one thing that Murdoch does, whether you like him or not, is he understands what the public wants. And
Hmm.
also, in terms of the Post, being a little bit schizophrenic in that he made it appealing to both the blue collar workers in the city and the Wall Streeters who read it on their train home. So it was this mix of high and low. And so from there, the Post establishes itself. It was not a liberal paper initially. I'm sorry, it was a liberal paper under Dorothy Schiff, very liberal and pro-Jewish. And once Murdoch buys it, it is not. He doesn't quickly change it into the conservative paper that it is today. In fact, the first political candidate he endorses is Ed Koch, who was very much a Democrat.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, and what he did do that was very unorthodox was start moving the endorsements of Koch to the front page of the paper, and really tilted. the coverage to pro Koch, and Koch was not really a leader in the race at that point, and the Post is largely responsible for electing Ed Koch.
Wow. Okay. I never would have, but of course, again, I would have been too young to really appreciate that. But
You were an embryo.
exactly. But so given everything that was taking place in 77, at the time when Murdoch took over, as you were saying, one of the big stories that was happening in New York was, of course, the Son of Sam killings, David Berkowitz. And at the time, the Daily News, from what I understand, was beating the Post when it came to scoops on the stories and, selling papers and etc. And so Rupert Murdoch, if I understand correctly, put pressure on the newsroom to catch up. What, how would you describe that urgency and the lengths that at the time Post reporters then took to make sure that they beat the New York Daily News in those headlines and those scoops?
Well, so Jimmy Breslin at the Daily News was the guy who was leading the Son of Sam coverage. David Berkowitz actually wrote him a letter, which he published, and that really set Murdoch on fire, and he was essentially whipping his reporters to get ahead of the story at the time, and really, I guess the personification of the Post at that time and then later is a guy named Steve Dunleavy, Australian. Murdoch imported him, and Dunleavy is on the case. He at first is not making any traction, but Son of Sam's last victim, Stacy Moskowitz, when she was killed, he rushed to the hospital and impersonated a hospital employee, I believe it was a grief counselor, and managed to take the mother of Stacy Moskowitz, get her into a separate room, and just have her download everything she was feeling. She did not know he was a reporter at that time. So the next day, the story appears, and the amazing thing to me is that Stacy Moskowitz's mother did not object. She liked the coverage so much, and she became a source for the paper. She became one of the Post's exclusive sources on that case. And there was even a rumor that Steve Dunleavy had an affair with her, which is a rumor, but we heard it.
Somehow fits for the Post.
Yes. Well, and Steve Dunleavy.
Yes. You know, Frank, there was also, I mean, I think I always remember page 6 being kind of that was the column that everybody was reading, and you see blind items that everybody used to be talking about, like, who are they talking about? And it was something back then that, looking back, really probably put a lot of fear into the people who were featured in the column back then. Now, you were part of page 6, you were an editor there. Tell us a little bit about how that worked. How did it work, being part of that kind of machine where, dealing with publicists and having people come after you and also developing relationships within that world?
Well, so page 6 was the first day that Murdoch published his version of the paper. Page 6 was in it. It was an idea of his from the very beginning. Uh, again, transplanted from the Fleet Street papers. It was a smart idea in that it was not tied to a personality. It was a joint effort so that if someone left, they could be replaced and not missed by whoever's reading it. Um, Initially, and this carried on into when I was there, Murdoch wanted this not to be strictly about celebrities. He wanted it to be very New York, about the powerful in New York. That included the television networks, politicians. There was a lot of political items on page 6. And it was New York was sort of rebounding at that time. It had come out of the 70s when it had come close to bankruptcy. And so we had all these characters like Donald Trump and like the Ian Schrager and Steve Rubell at Studio 54. So there were all these New York characters that became sort of part of Page Six's novel, which is a serial novel published 5 times a week. And it became a powerful tool both for the Post because everyone read it, and then for the people who learned to feed items to it. One of those people was Roy Cohn, and who was a very big source of Page Six. Now, when I was there, Cohn had already died. I was there. I started as a freelancer in '89, and I was there through '92 or three. It's funny, I'm forgetting already. Um, it was at that time. It was celebrity was really kind of taking over at in American culture. And you also had the point where publicists were also taking more control of their clients and regulating uh, what they said and what they released. It was sort of the emergence of Tom Cruise. So a lot of what we got was obtained by going out at night and confronting people, asking them questions, observing their behavior, and also sources who were feeding us. While I was there, the big story, and actually was so big that they took it from Page Six and it became a long running. I think it's the second most consecutive covers of the at the Post. This was Woody Allen's affair with Suni and the breakup of his
Hmm.
marriage and all of that. Joanna Malloy, my colleague, broke that story, and that became an international story, and Joanna broke that. She was the first reporter to have that story. And the thing about Page Six is it could be confrontational. Um, and I remember being at a very powerful entertainment attorney's lawyer, and Robert De Niro was a client of his. And I was walking by, I was covering the wedding, and I walked by, and he was talking to someone in the music industry that I knew. And the guy said, "Oh, hey, have you met Robert De Niro?" And so I introduced myself, and De Niro said, he said, "Your name, huh?" He goes, "Where do you work?" And I said, "Page Six." And he goes, "Page Six, you fucking prick." And and that was the end of that conversation. Uh,
But it's toned down a lot. I mean, from compared to then, don't you think? I mean, it feels much, at least for me, I feel like I don't know about everybody else, but I know for me, I feel like the Page Six feels a lot much more in line with mainstream gossip today or blogs or whatever.
that has a lot to do with the internet. You can publish gossip instantly. The celebrities have learned to use social media to tell their stories and control the narrative. So I still think Page Six manages to get a lot of scoops. I know that Elon Musk has been quoted in the paper. I'm pretty sure they broke uh, the breakup of Jeff Bezos's marriage. So they're still breaking stuff, but a lot of it is, stuff that I think are fed through reality shows. You see a lot of Kim Kardashian and the Real Housewives, and that's just because it's hard to break stories in this age when news is instant.
Well, that is certainly the truth. Um, but in addition to the news that Page Six may or may not be able to break, one thing that has been consistent about the Post, at least as long as I've been aware of it, is the headlines. And so when we were
Yes.
preparing when we were preparing for this, Dom and I were going back and forth over some of our favorites. Some of which we might be embarrassed to admit, some not. But so let's see. Some of the headlines that really stood out to both of us were, of course, Ford to City, drop dead. That was
Right. Well,
great.
wait, that was the Daily News.
Oh, that was the Daily News. Oh,
That was the
see,
Daily News. Yeah.
this was the other thing that we were having is that, like, we forgot that some of the Daily News headlines were as good, if not better, than the Post. Because what I
Well,
always thought was, oh, Dom, what were you going to say?
yeah, no, you were saying, no, you were saying, remember you had that
Yeah,
one
my
headline that you
absolute
thought,
favorite headline that I ever saw on a New York tab line was Dark Side of the Loon, which I attributed to the Post for years and years and years until we were preparing for this. And it was like, no, that was the Daily News.
What was
It
that story about?
That was about the astronaut who
oh my
had the love
goodness,
triangle with the guy in Cape
Oh,
Canaveral and
yeah.
then drove
in
Oh,
diapers.
right.
in the
Oh my
dark.
God. That's right. That's right.
Anyway,
Well, look, the tabloid, the Daily News and the Post were fighting it out. for survival, especially when I was there. Both papers were in severe financial straits, and I was there not well, Murdoch did not own the paper when I was there. Peter Calico, the real estate developer, owned it. So the competition was fierce, brutal,
It
and
felt like it.
it often showed in the headlines. One of my favorite recent ones is Grand Theft Ottoman, which was when Eric Adams was indicted over the Turkish alleged bribes. But the Post, you've probably heard the famous Post headline, "Headless Body and Topless
Yeah.
Bar,"
Yep.
which is probably the most, and if you've actually read that story, what actually happened, it's not a funny story in any way. So, they often would come up with the headlines before the story was written and filed, and then the story was fit to the headline, which is
How
pretty
does that
interesting.
even
Which
work?
is
How,
wild. Yeah,
yeah.
how does that?
You do a lot of rewriting and cutting, and this was largely in the Murdoch days in the beginning. And then some of the greatest headlines were never published, and
Wait, there were
I know
lines
one.
that were too far for the Post?
Yes, yes. There was a very big story in 1980, I believe, where a violinist for the Metropolitan Opera was taken to the roof and eventually thrown off down into a shaftway and died.
Oh my
And
goodness.
the headline that they considered was "Fiddler Off the Roof," but that was not used. And then
Yeah, no, not cool, even for the
no.
Post.
And then I don't know, you're probably too young for the Covenant House scandal, but Bruce Ritter was the head of Covenant House, an organization that took in homeless teens and youth. And
I've since heard about it, but yeah.
yes, he had an affair with a male prostitute who was there, and it became a huge scandal. And in fact, the Post broke that story, and probably should have gotten a Pulitzer Prize for it. But we were the paper of wreckage, not the paper of record. But the headlines that were going around that time were pretty salacious and never printed. The male prostitute's name was Kevin Kite, and one of the headlines thrown around was "Our Father who art in heaven," and then "Kingdom Come," in which "come" was spelled C-U-M.
Of
Oh
course
my.
it was.
Well, that was a thing though, Frank. Like I noticed that looking back at some of those headlines, I was telling Jenna, I was like, I don't want to read those because they're, it was a different time. You know what I mean? Now, I
That is a
remember those
thing.
headlines back then, but you saying those same headlines today, you feel, I don't, it just makes you feel a certain way. Like I don't feel comfortable saying this and laughing about it because
Right.
it really is very different. They've also evolved too, though, correct? Like they've also evolved over time. Like they still try to put a headline together, but at the same point, they're well, I don't know if I should say I'm thinking back to some of the stories I've been clicking and I'm not sure if actually they have, but they seem much more evolved than back then.
Yes and no. I would say, the Post is very anti-woke culture and very anti political correctness. So perhaps there is a little bit more restraint, but and it's funny, I can't think of something that was really outrageous of recent note, but
I remember
perhaps you're right.
Bullseye from the beginning of the Iraq War, which even
Bullseye.
then I was like, God, that's not funny. That's not. But
Right,
anyway,
right.
Well, one of
um,
my
yeah.
one of my other favorite ones was best sex I've ever had, which I think, we were talking about that earlier, Jenna. We were like, Jenna was like, well, who is that about? I was like, our current president, which was, of course, said by allegedly by Marla Maples back
Marla
then when they
Maples,
were
yeah.
still right. I think they were just, I don't know if they were dating or they had to, whatever it was that was going on. But like, I think that's the thing too about the relationship, I guess, between the Post and Donald Trump. He was such a big figure within that world of
Wasn't he
the New York
calling in as
Post.
his own press secretary at one point?
Yes,
Allegedly.
Richard Barron. What I
Yes.
find it interesting that his son's name is Barron. I wonder
Mm.
where there's a
Pure
connection there.
coincidence.
You know what? I didn't think of that. I didn't put that together.
The best sex I ever had is I believe arguably the second most famous post headline. Yes, and it was attributed to Marla Maples, who the next day denied it. Newsstand sales were all important at that time, and an editor told me that three people sold the paper off the newsstands: John Gotti, the mafia kingpin, George Steinbrenner, the owner of the Yankees, and Donald Trump. And mostly when Donald Trump was involved with another woman, which is why so many of the woods, as the cover is called, the cover headline, were about him and another woman.
Okay, speaking of, since I'm dying to know what was the biggest post headline, I will say this. I was working in a New York City newsroom when the news broke that then Governor Eliot Spitzer was caught with a prostitute, whose name Dominic reminded me was Ashley Dupree. When that story broke, well, right before the night of, before the day of the headlines, we were in the newsroom, and the general consensus was we cannot wait to see what the Post does with this. And sure enough, the next morning, we all wake up to oh no. And so
Oh no.
did that make the top 10? Because I thought that was chef's kiss genius.
Well, Murdoch was there's a story where Murdoch is sitting in his private plane when he gets the call from the editor at the time, Call Allen, about this breaking, and he was rubbing his hands with glee and like saying this headline has to be great. So apparently it was one of his favorite headlines. Supposedly, the best sex I ever had, and the coverage. I think there were 8 days of coverage after that, or it was one of 8 days of coverage. Lifted the Post circulation by 150,000, according to the Post.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think that's again, I think that's the second most popular, and I don't know in terms of circulation what Headless Body did, but that's the one that is most often cited. And actually, the writer of that headline ended up on the David Letterman show, so it made a big ripple.
Well, it's interesting because like really back then, the Post really was um on its own. Like it seemed to really create it was an early day what cable news sort of became, like when Fox News, which is owned, of course, by Rupert Murdoch. Um, was it the was it the paper that kind of created this kind of divide within the media and within the political world too? It's kind of like us versus them, especially with a lot of people who are reading the Post. I definitely know in New York, a lot of people reading the Post were particular, usually working class and had a different type of maybe a little bit more, of course, conservative.
Totally. And again, I think the Post is not, I mean, I don't know if credit's the word, but the Post is, I think the influence over the media we have today is huge because so Murdoch starts the Post, and then when he's forced to sell it by Ted Kennedy, he has already expanded into television. He starts a network, the Fox network, and one of the first shows that's created is A Current Affair. And A Current Affair is
Oh,
essentially the
that's
Post
right.
television. And he even imports Steve Dunleavy is one of its top correspondents,
Hmm.
and a number of people who worked at the Post became producers there. So you have that, and it's so successful that it spawns a whole bunch of copycats from by other networks and syndicators. And by the time that dies down, Murdoch is, working on Fox News. And so you get Fox News, which is a very one-sided approach to the news, especially politics. And then MSNBC emerges. Now, initially, it wasn't such a left progressive cable news network, but it
Hmm.
becomes in reaction to that. So now we have these two, and then CNN. I don't know. CNN seems to be deciding it was also very left for a while when Jeff Zucker ran it, but it's seems to be trying to figure out where it fits in. But now
I'd say
you
it's
have
still in a discovery period for itself right
yeah,
now.
right, and so now you have these two major cable news networks, 24 hours, battling it out. And as you pointed out, Dominic, there, each is showing one side of the argument. And as a result, I think, you don't get people, you don't get liberals watching Fox News and you don't get conservatives watching MSNBC. And so you're not, they're preaching to the converted, and I don't think anyone's learning anything really. I should give credit to MSNBC because they do report the news. They are an ethical brand, as opposed to Fox, which is it depends day by day and show by show. But I think that's where we're at now, and it's very fractionalized, and it's not helping our culture.
Well, it's interesting. So just remind me one more time, what was the show that Murdoch created after taking over the Post again?
It was called A Current Affair.
Okay, A Current Affair. Here's why, because I distinctly remember A Current Affair. And one of the things that I've been obsessed with, and Dom's heard me talk about this numerous times. So when I was a kid, I used to be a competitive ice skater. I know that's weird, but that was the thing I was into. And so when the whole Tanya Harding debacle happened,
Right.
eventually, everybody was following it and it was wild. But eventually there was a movie made about her life, I, Tanya. And in the movie, they include one of those theoretically journalists. And he says, I worked for a show called Current Affair, which traditional media looked down on and then eventually became. And that stuck with me as something that I'm just like, yeah, that was a huge impact on how we consumed what was otherwise salacious stories.
Right, right. And even the New York Times gave it a very positive review when it came out, which is very interesting in light of the Times sort of liberal stance. And at the time it was very high-minded and not prone to compliment stuff like that. And then you saw when those shows became uh, popular and successful, you saw that bleed into a lot of the network stuff like Dateline and To Catch a Predator. um, this the influence of the Post, I think, is it's unmistakable.
By the way, if the writer of that film ever hears this podcast, please feel free because I am dying to talk to you.
Frank, what about I think, it's interesting because you mentioned the New York Times and you look at today and how the news industry works, and so much of it is about grabbing the audience's attention, grabbing people's attention because you're on the internet, it's like you're on podcasts, whatever it is you're doing, you have to grab people somehow and make them listen. Um, and it's interesting because I know there was I think the Daily Show did something recently making fun of how the New York Times has made their headlines sexier about when they've been reporting about Trump. And it makes me just think about the kind of impact that the New York Post has really had in terms of the headlines, things that back then people criticized and looked and said, who are these guys with these crazy headlines? Nobody takes them seriously yet have won awards in terms of some of their investigative stories and have also really changed the way people look at, grabbing headlines, getting people's attention today. I mean, what do you think? Has the Post gotten its fair? Has it gotten enough credit for how it's changed media?
No, and I mean, and a large part of that has to do with the fact that it's such a polarizing paper, which is why Susan and I didn't want to just write a book. We thought that we really needed to talk to, and we ended up, I think, interviewing 250 people
Wow.
for the book. And we wanted nuance. We wanted, and we found a lot of surprising things, which was that even people who had been fired and who despise the Post's political stance today said it was the best job they ever had. I think one of the things the Post did, which has been, I guess, I don't know, mimicked or by papers, or at least taken into account, is it took subjects that might have been dealt with in a dry sort of jargon laced way, and transfer them to people. The stories became about people who symbolized something, whether it was no heat in their apartment because of the landlord. They really made it personal. And the other thing they did was, sometimes if they found the right subject, it almost became like a telenovela where they were covered for weeks and months. I don't remember the runaway bride who ditched her wedding and then
Oh
disappeared.
yeah.
I mean, she became a
Yup.
running story for months, and they were sending reporters to stake out her house. The Post did that, and I think it made for more compelling journalism. Is, whether or not it was accurate, you have to take everything story by story.
I like that. I like that part. But you already talked a little bit about this, but what was it about telling that story about the Post to read your book, you writing the book with Susan, and what was it about this time that you felt like we should be talking about the Post now? People, this is the time that people need to hear the story about this paper, and not just about a history lesson, but from the people who really worked there.
Right. So Susan really, the idea came from a lunch she had with a someone who had a pretty influential public relations firm during the 80s and 90s. And this person said, an oral history about the Post would be great. And the minute she said it to me, I was like, yeah, well, I had been at Vanity Fair, and my first story for Vanity Fair was an oral history of page six. Um, and that turned out to be a- just a lot of fun. And, we had both been there and we'd heard all these crazy stories. We knew about Trump's sort of role and the Post role in sort of uh, turning Trump into a celebrity. And we just thought, okay. And then the other thing we thought was a lot of the people who've worked at the Post are getting up there in age. We signed the contract right before the pandemic hit, and you know, thankfully, a lot of people didn't have jobs they had a lot of time to talk to us. But then a lot of people have since died. So we're really happy that we got this history down. The other thing about the Post is it's like a shark. It's always moving forward. Murdoch is not interested in, his legacy in terms of the Post. We really thought it should be put down on paper.
Hmm.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. Because I think the legacy of any media outlet, especially one that's, so influential, should be recorded. But I want to kind of pivot a little bit and ask maybe for your advice. So I think I'm a pretty good journalist and reporter, but I'm terrible at headlines. I'm the worst. I don't know. I'm too literal. I'm not good at it. Maybe I'm too hesitant. So if you had advice to a journalist, because we're moving into a space where more and more of us are working independently, what is your advice when it comes to headline writing? What's the most important thing or the few most important things to keep in the front of your mind when you're writing the headline?
Well, what's interesting, now that I work for a brand that is largely digital, SEO comes into
Hmm.
yes, and
Hmm.
SEO means the creativity is almost not good. I mean, you have to think of if someone was searching for this story and didn't really know the details, what would they look for? And so that means in my opinion, cleverness is not a good thing. And that's, I came from the tabloids, which were all about coming up with something very clever, a play on words like Grand Theft Ottoman, and where you're like, oh my God, that's funny. It's interesting, it's compelling. I gotta share this with my friends. And so I think, double entendres are good. And plays on common phrases that tweak it so that it's not common anymore. Sort of turning a cliche on its head. That's the way that tabloid headlines work. Susan and I wrote an essay for Vanity Fair about the Trump cabinet, and we came up with our own headline, which was "Defiling Cabinet," because of all the people who have been hired that are just what have were the Post not so in Donald Trump's corner, they would be having a field day with these people in the cabinet.
Hmm.
Yeah, oh my God, there's just so much fodder.
Yeah.
I guess kind of gotten to the point, Frank, where we ask all our guests at the end to talk about what made you want to pursue a career in journalism.
All right. uh,
The big
no,
Deep
question.
breath.
I was very fortunate to in high school. My high school, I'm from Youngstown, Ohio. I went to a school called Portman High School, and we had a journalism program, and it was run by this amazing woman, Dolores P. Sullivan, who had a beehive hairdo, and she had gotten polio, so she had an arm that was paralyzed, and she would hit it and put it on her side and go, wow. And but she was amazing. She taught us all the basics of journalism. She was a taskmaster, and she ran the paper. And so I was named one of the co-editors in my senior year. I loved it. And the other thing that she did was she would enter the paper in the Columbia Scholastic Journalism Program awards. Forgive me. And we would often be nominated. I think we won a couple of times. And so Dolores, who loved New York City, took whoever was allowed to go with their parents to New York City for the awards. And at night, she would go to Broadway plays, and we would run wild in the city. And for a boy from Ohio, New York was just amazing. And this was when it was still a fairly dangerous place, but I knew I wanted to live there. And so in college, I went to the University of Pittsburgh, and they had a journalism. I worked for an entertainment supplement there called Showcase, and they even paid us, which was incredible. And I love that too. And so I moved to New York as soon as I graduated from college, and got a job at a trade magazine about television, and then it went from there. Funny thing is that when I was in college, I wanted to become a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, but I just loved journalism so much, and I found that I could use what I learned, because real journalism really is about people and understanding why people, or at least attempting to understand why people do what they do. So it has benefited me.
And I think that's always been what's the draw for me is, yeah,
Hmm.
understanding
Same.
people's decisions, even the ones that I don't understand or agree with, but I'm
Hmm.
still genuinely, in
Yeah,
fact, the more I disagree with it, the more fascinated I am.
right. And there's plenty of that today.
Woo.
We've got
Oh,
yeah, there's no end to
Well, listen, we want to thank you so much, Frank, for joining us. Cannot emphasize enough. The book is called Paper of Wreckage, filled with the stories that Frank's been telling us and so much more. But it's Paper of Wreckage, the rogues, renegades, wise guys, wankers, and relentless reporters who redefined American media. Thank you so much for taking time to speak
thank you,
with us.
Frank.
This has been great.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
All right. Later. Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Jenna Flanagan and Dominic Camia.
Music provided by Jake Howitt. Research by Laura Rothenbucker.
You can watch and follow us on YouTube.
Or you can listen and follow us wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you have any questions or suggestions, we want to hear from you. So leave a comment.
We do check them.
Or reach out to us anytime at laidoffandlookingpod@gmail.com.
New episodes every Friday.